The midnight storm hammered against the windows of the Anderson home, each thunderclap making the old Virginia farmhouse creak and moan. Inside, a different kind of vigilance took shape. Shadow, a massive German shepherd with battle-scarred ears and knowing amber eyes, lay curled in a perfect circle around 2-year-old Lily's tiny sleeping form. His 120-pound frame rose and fell with each breath, creating a living fortress of fur and muscle. From the doorway, Jessica Anderson watched, clutching her dead husband's dog tags until her knuckles whitened. The shepherd's ears twitched at a sound outside too deliberate to be wind. A low growl built in Shadow's throat, but he didn't move an inch from his position around the child. "I know what you're thinking," Jessica whispered. "You failed them once. Never again." The dog's eyes met hers in the darkness, ancient and understanding, as headlights swept slowly across the bedroom wall. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Along with the city you're watching from now, let's continue with the story. Shadow hadn't always been Shadow. Before Matthew Anderson named him, he'd been Ajax. Military working dog, number 3742, a top-tier German shepherd with 5 successful deployments and a reputation for unflinching loyalty. The scars crossing his muscular chest and the notch missing from his left ear told stories of service that earned him a Silver Star, unusual for a K9, but Matthew had insisted. Now those amber eyes, once trained to detect explosives and track insurgents, kept careful watch over a perimeter measuring exactly the circumference of a toddler's sleeping form. Lieutenant Matthew Anderson had been a rising star in Army intelligence, a Virginia boy with an easy smile and hard eyes that had seen 3 tours before his 35th birthday. His fellow soldiers called him Book for his methodical approach to everything from mission planning to Sunday barbecues. 8 months ago, Matthew Anderson left for what he called a routine training exercise and returned in a flag-draped casket, leaving behind a confused widow, a fatherless daughter, and a shepherd who still waited by the door every evening at 6. Jessica Anderson, 29 and already wearing the hollow expression of a military widow, had been a kindergarten teacher before Lily was born. Her auburn hair, once long and carefully styled, now hung in a practical ponytail as she navigated the impossible terrain of grief while raising a 2-year-old who asked for Dada with heartbreaking regularity. The house on Willow Creek Lane, once filled with Matthew's laughter and plans for the future, now echoed with unanswered questions. Lily Anderson, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, understood only that her world had changed. At 2, she recognized the comfort of Shadow's fur, the safety of his constant presence, and somehow seemed to understand that when she buried her face in his neck, the giant dog would stand sentinel until whatever scared her had passed. The small military community that surrounded them included Frank Wilson, Matthew's former commander, a silver-haired man with a perpetual frown who checked on them with clockwork regularity, Eleanor Blackwood, the 70-something widow next door who brought casseroles and watched Lily with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, and Daniel Pierce, the newcomer who'd moved into the Sullivan place 3 months ago, whose friendly smiles never quite reached his eyes when he offered to help Jessica with yard work or home repairs. The day Shadow lost his puppies had been unseasonably warm for February at Fort Benning. No one had predicted the sudden temperature drop or the violent storm that swept across the base that night. Matthew had been away on a 3-day training exercise when the kennel roof partially collapsed under the weight of unexpected ice. Shadow, then still called Ajax, had managed to shield 3 of his 5 puppies with his body, but the other 2 couldn't withstand the cold that crept in through the damaged structure. By morning, the temperature had plummeted to well below freezing. Found him curled around all 5 of them, the kennel master had told Matthew when he returned. Wouldn't let anyone near for hours. The 2 smaller ones were already gone, but he kept trying to warm them up. Never seen anything like it. That dog understood death, sir. He knew. Matthew had sat in the mud beside the grieving shepherd for hours, not touching, just being present while the dog stared at nothing. When Shadow finally allowed Matthew to lead him away, something fundamental had changed in the animal. The military veterinarian suggested the dog might need to be retired from service after displaying signs of what they cautiously termed canine traumatic stress. But Matthew had insisted on working with him personally. "He's not broken," Matthew had argued. "He just knows what it means to lose something you're supposed to protect. That makes him more valuable, not less." In the months that followed, the bond between handler and dog deepened into something the other handler spoke about with a mix of admiration and unease. Shadow, renamed because Matthew said the dog had walked through the shadow of death and come out carrying it with him, became infamous for his protective instincts, refusing to leave Matthew's side during operations and once famously disobeying a direct recall command when he sensed an ambush ahead. "That dog ain't natural," Staff Sergeant Davis had commented after Shadow alerted to an IED that had been missed by every detection protocol. "It's like he's got a sixth sense about danger." The last time Shadow saw Matthew in uniform had been on a Tuesday morning. Jessica remembered because she'd been folding laundry when Matthew received the call. His face had changed as he listened, becoming the mask she recognized from previous deployments, the one that meant he was going somewhere dangerous but couldn't tell her why. "Just a training thing at Quantico," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. 3 days, 4 tops. That night, after Lily had been put to bed, Jessica had found Matthew in the backyard with Shadow. Her husband was kneeling, his forehead pressed against the shepherd's, speaking in a low voice that stopped her from interrupting. She'd watched from the kitchen window as Matthew took Shadow's massive head between his hands and stared directly into the dog's eyes. "Titan, if anything happens to me, you protect them. Emma and Lily, that's your mission now. That's my final order." Matthew's voice had cracked slightly, something Jessica had never heard before. "You understand me. Boy, you're the guardian now." The memory still made Jessica's throat tighten. Matthew had known something sensed something before that final mission. The official report called it a training accident, but the closed casket and Frank Wilson's inability to meet her eyes at the funeral told a different story. Shadow had known the moment Matthew wasn't coming back. 3 days after Matthew left, before any official notification. The shepherd had abandoned his usual post by the front window and begun a methodical patrol of the house perimeter, checking doors and windows with a new urgency. When the notification team arrived the following morning, Shadow had stood between them and Jessica until the chaplain spoke Matthew's name. The dog's grief had manifested in a week-long vigil by the front door, refusing food and water until Jessica had finally broken down, sliding to the floor beside him with Lily in her arms. "He's not coming back," she'd sobbed into Shadow's fur. "He's never coming back." Only then had Shadow finally turned from the door, gently taking the sleeve of her sweater in his mouth and leading her away, as if accepting that his mission had changed. The days following the funeral passed in a haze for Jessica. Casseroles appeared and disappeared. Lily asked for her father with increasing confusion. Shadow began sleeping at the foot of Lily's bed rather than in his customary place in the hallway. 6 weeks after the funeral, Jessica had noticed the first strange car, a black sedan with tinted windows, that drove past their house 3 times in one afternoon. When she mentioned it to Frank during his weekly check-in, his reaction had been oddly dismissive. Probably just someone lost. These back roads all look the same to city folks. But that night, Shadow had refused to settle, pacing between Lily's room and the front windows until Jessica finally looked outside to find the same car parked at the end of their long driveway. By the time she'd found her phone to call the police, the car was gone, but Shadow's behavior had changed permanently. From that night forward, he began sleeping curled around Lily's small body, his eyes always oriented toward the bedroom door. 2 months after Matthew's death, Jessica had found a folded piece of paper tucked into the collar of Shadow's dress uniform harness, the one Matthew had insisted the dog wear for formal photographs and ceremonies. "If you're reading this, something's happened to me," Matthew had written in his precise handwriting. "It probably looks like an accident. It wasn't. Trust Shadow. He knows who's safe and who isn't. Even if I never told you, he was never just a dog to me. He's a soldier with the mission, and his mission now is you and Lily." The note had sent a chill through Jessica that had nothing to do with the April evening's cool breeze. She'd dismissed it initially as Matthew's military paranoia, something she'd seen in other soldiers who'd served too many high-stress deployments. But then she remembered the black sedan, and Frank's too casual dismissal, and Shadow's strange new protectiveness. That same night, she'd awakened to Shadow's low warning growl, a sound so different from his normal communications that she'd instantly been fully alert. In the dim glow of Lily's nightlight, she'd watched as the shepherd positioned himself between the bedroom window and the sleeping child, his hackles raised and teeth bared at something outside in the darkness. Jessica had called the police, who found nothing but footprints in the soft earth beneath Lily's window footprints that stopped abruptly at the edge of the driveway, as if someone had been watching the house. "Probably just kids," the young deputy had suggested with an uncomfortable glance at Shadow, who hadn't relaxed his vigilant posture even when the officers entered the room. "But we'll increase patrols in the area for a few days." That was the night Jessica had truly begun to believe there might be something to Matthew's warning. Shadow wasn't acting like a pet grieving its owner. He was acting like a soldier who'd received his orders and understood the stakes of failure. 6 months after Matthew's death, the military insurance payments had begun to dwindle, and Jessica faced the harsh economic reality of single motherhood, the mortgage on their modest farmhouse, once easily managed on Matthew's lieutenant's salary and her part-time teaching income, now loomed as an impossible mountain. The practical voice in her head, the one that sounded suspiciously like her mother, suggested that keeping a 120-pound German shepherd with specialized dietary needs might be a luxury she could no longer afford. "Have you thought about what I said?" Eleanor Blackwood asked one afternoon, her arthritic hands wrapped around a mug of tea at Jessica's kitchen table. "My nephew over at Riverdale Kennels said they're looking for breeding stock. Shadow's got credentials, papers. Military bloodlines fetch a premium." Jessica watched through the window as Shadow followed Lily's toddling exploration of the backyard. Never more than 2 feet from the child, adjusting his massive body to create shade when she lingered too long in the sun. "I can't sell him. Ellie," Jessica said, the words catching in her throat. "He's not just a dog to us." "Honey, I understand grief attachments. When Harold passed, I slept with his bathrobe for a year," Eleanor said, her weathered face softening. "But that dog eats more than you do. And Lily needs new clothes, school savings. Matthew would understand." Perhaps Eleanor was right. Matthew would understand the practical necessities of caring for their daughter. But every time Jessica considered making the call to Riverdale Kennels, she remembered Matthew's final instructions to Shadow and the dog's unwavering commitment to his assigned mission. That night, Jessica woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of Shadow's nails on the hardwood floor. She'd grown accustomed to his nighttime ritual, a methodical patrol of the house's perimeter, checking each window and door before returning to Lily's room. But tonight, something was different. His pattern had changed, and instead of completing his circuit, he remained at the back door, a low rumble building in his chest. Jessica slipped from bed and padded down the hallway, pausing to check on Lily, who slept peacefully with her stuffed bunny clutched to her chest. The house was silent, except for the distant drone of cicadas and Shadow's quiet growling. When she reached the kitchen, she found the shepherd standing rigid, his attention fixed on the back door's deadbolt, which Jessica suddenly realized was not in the locked position. She was certain she'd locked it before bed. It had become an obsessive habit since Matthew's death. Her hand hovered over the light switch when Shadow's growl intensified, stopping her. Instead, she reached for her cell phone on the counter and backed slowly toward Lily's room. The subtle click of the door handle turning froze her in place. Shadow's posture changed, his body lowering into the attack stance she'd seen during Matthew's training demonstrations. The door eased open, revealing a sliver of the dark porch beyond and the silhouette of a man slipping inside. What happened next occurred with such speed and precision that Jessica would later struggle to describe it to the police. Shadow launched across the kitchen like a fur-covered missile, his jaws clamping around the intruder's forearm with a sickening crunch. The man's scream shattered the night's stillness as he stumbled backward, the shepherd driving him back through the doorway and onto the porch. Jessica slammed the door shut and fumbled with the lock, while Shadow's snarls and the man's increasingly desperate shouts continued outside. By the time the county sheriff's deputies arrived 12 minutes later, the intruder had managed to escape, leaving behind a torn jacket sleeve, a significant amount of blood, and a 9mm pistol with the serial number filed off. Shadow stood guard on the porch steps, blood darkening his muzzle, his eyes still scanning the darkness beyond the yard. "Ma'am, you got any enemies we should know about?" Deputy Lawson asked, eyeing Shadow with newfound respect as the dog allowed the officers to process the scene but refused to move far from the house entrance. "No," Jessica answered automatically, then hesitated. "At least, I didn't think so." The break-in attempt changed everything. Jessica could no longer pretend that Matthew's cryptic warning was just paranoia, not with evidence of a planned armed intrusion scattered across her back porch. But what could someone possibly want from a widow and her toddler? The answer came the following day, when Jessica, still shaken and operating on minimal sleep, decided to thoroughly clean Shadow's sleeping area in the mudroom. The dog had always been particular about his bed, a military-grade foam mattress that Matthew had special ordered, refusing to allow anyone to move or clean it except on his own terms. Today, however, Shadow seemed to make an exception, watching calmly as Jessica lifted the heavy bedding. Beneath the dog bed, secured to the floor with duct tape, was a waterproof document pouch containing Matthew's personal journal and a sealed envelope with Jessica's name written in her husband's distinctive block lettering. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single page of notebook paper and a small key. "Jess," the note began, "if you're reading this, then you've either gotten curious about what Shadow guards so carefully or something has happened that made you look. Either way, be careful who you trust with what's in this journal. Not everything was as it seemed with Operation Blacksmith. What happened wasn't an accident. The key opens a deposit box at First Federal. Account number on the back. I love you both. Always. M." The journal contained Matthew's meticulous notes about something called Operation Blacksmith, detailed observations about several of his superior officers, including Frank Wilson, and encrypted entries that Jessica couldn't decipher. The final entry, dated the day before he left on his last mission, read simply, "Confirmation received. Meeting Wilson tomorrow. If correct, this goes all the way to Langley. Shadow knows the contingency plan." Jessica had just hidden the journal in her bedroom when a knock at the front door sent Shadow into alert mode. Frank Wilson stood on her porch, his silver hair neatly combed, wearing civilian clothes but standing with the rigid posture of a career military man. "Thought I'd check in," he said with the same forced casualness he'd adopted since Matthew's funeral. "Heard about the excitement last night. You and Lily okay?" "We're fine," Jessica replied, not opening the screen door. Shadow positioned himself between her legs and the entrance, his demeanor calm but vigilant. "Deputy Lawson said it was probably just a random break-in attempt." Frank's eyes flickered to Shadow, noting the dog's protective stance. "Good thing you kept Matthew's dog. Told you he'd be worth the expense." Something in his tone, a calculated approval that hadn't been there during his previous suggestions that perhaps Shadow was too much dog for a young widow, raised Jessica's internal alarms. "Shadow's family," she said firmly. "We'd never give him up." Frank nodded, his eyes drifting past her into the house. "Smart decision. Say, I was going through some of Matthew's personal effects that were returned from his locker. Found some papers that might be important for his benefits. Mind if I come in? Won't take but a minute to explain them." Jessica had always trusted Frank. He'd been Matthew's commanding officer for 3 years, had spoken at the funeral about Matthew's dedication and intelligence, had checked on them weekly since the burial. But now, with Matthew's journal hidden in her bedroom, and Shadow's unusual tension radiating against her legs, she found herself inventing an excuse. "Actually, Lily's napping, and I was just heading out to an appointment. Can you leave them with me to look over?" A brief flicker of something disappointment, frustration crossed Frank's features before his professional mask returned. "Of course. I'll drop them by tomorrow." He turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, Jessica, has anyone else from the unit been by recently? Anyone asking questions about Matthew's last assignment?" "No," she lied smoothly, thinking of the journal hidden upstairs. "Should they have been Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. No, no. Just checking. Matthew was involved in some sensitive work. Sometimes reporters get curious about training accidents. If anyone comes around asking questions, you'll let me know first. Right? For security reasons. After Frank left, Jessica watched through the window as he sat in his government-issued sedan for several long minutes, apparently making a phone call before finally driving away. Only then did Shadow relax his vigilant posture, looking up at Jessica with an expression that seemed to say, "Now, you understand." That night, as Shadow performed his usual security checks before curling his massive body around Lily's sleeping form, Jessica made her decision. Whatever it cost, whatever sacrifices she needed to make, Shadow would remain with them. He wasn't just a pet or even a reminder of Matthew. He was the guardian Matthew had trusted with his most precious treasures, and possibly the key to understanding what had really happened to her husband. The process of investigating your dead husband's final mission while raising a toddler wasn't something covered in any of the military wives' support groups Jessica had half-heartedly attended. In the weeks following the break-in attempt, she established a careful routine during Lily's afternoon naps. She would spread Matthew's journal pages across the dining room table, cross-referencing his cryptic notes with news articles and carefully worded inquiries to other military spouses whose husbands had served with Matthew. Shadow, seemingly understanding the significance of her task, would position himself by the front window during these sessions, his amber eyes scanning the road with methodical vigilance. Occasionally, he would rise suddenly and move to a different window, tracking something outside that Jessica couldn't see, before returning to his post with a soft huff that somehow conveyed all clear more effectively than words could have. The journal itself was a puzzle with missing pieces. Matthew had written much of it in a personal shorthand, with references to people by initials rather than names and locations, described by seemingly random numbers that Jessica eventually realized corresponded to coordinates on a map. Operation Blacksmith appeared to involve weapons transport, legitimate on paper, but Matthew's notes suggested something wasn't adding up in the inventory counts. B.S. confirms 200 units marked for disposal actually diverted to private contractor. Read one entry. F.W. insists normal procedure but documentation missing. Need to check serial numbers against Pentagon records. F.W. had to be Frank Wilson, which explained his unusual interest in Matthew's personal effects. But who was B.S.? And what were the units Matthew had been tracking? Jessica was pondering this question one Tuesday morning when a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Shadow, who had been napping beside Lily's play area in the living room, was instantly alert, moving swiftly to the door, but not giving his warning growl. This, Jessica had learned, was his way of indicating a visitor he considered non-threatening. Daniel Pierce stood on her porch, holding a covered casserole dish and wearing what Jessica had come to think of as his helpful neighbor smile. In the 3 months since he'd moved into the Sullivan place down the road, Daniel had made himself a fixture in their lives, offering to mow her lawn, fix a leaking pipe in the downstairs bathroom, even babysitting Lily once when Jessica had a doctor's appointment and Eleanor was visiting her sister in Richmond. "Thought you might appreciate some actual food," Daniel said, handing her the dish. "Noticed you haven't been getting out much, and there's only so much mac and cheese a person can eat." Jessica accepted the dish with genuine gratitude. At 40-something, Daniel Pierce had the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, salt and pepper hair, laugh lines around his eyes, and the kind of practical competence that came from years of fixing things. He'd mentioned being a retired contractor who'd moved to their rural Virginia community seeking peace and quiet after years in the D.C. construction chaos. "Thanks, Daniel. That's really thoughtful," Jessica said, noticing how Shadow had positioned himself between Daniel and Lily, who was stacking blocks on the living room floor. Despite Daniel's many kindnesses over the past months, the shepherd had never warmed to him, maintaining a polite but unmistakable distance whenever the man visited. "No trouble at all. Eleanor mentioned you've had some excitement lately," Daniel said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Break-in attempt." "News travels fast," Jessica replied, suddenly conscious of Matthew's journal pages spread across the dining room table, visible from where they stood. Daniel shrugged. "Small town. You okay? Need any security upgrades? I could install some motion sensor lights, maybe a better deadbolt on that back door." "We're fine," Jessica said, perhaps too quickly. "Deputy Lawson said it was probably just random." Daniel's eyes flickered to Shadow, then back to Jessica. "That dog's worth his weight in gold. Isn't he military trained? Right, Matthew's service dog." "Working dog," Jessica corrected automatically, the distinction Matthew had always insisted upon. "But yes, he's been a blessing." "Well, the offer stands if you need any help with security. Or anything else," Daniel added, his gaze drifting toward the dining room again. "Looks like you're busy with paperwork. Insurance claims can be a nightmare after a death, can't they?" Something in his too casual observation made Jessica step slightly to block his view. "Just organizing some of Matthew's things. Thanks again for the casserole." After Daniel left, Jessica watched from the window as he walked back to his truck. Instead of leaving immediately, he sat in the vehicle for several minutes, apparently looking at something on his phone. Shadow stood beside her, a low rumble building in his chest that hadn't been present during the actual conversation. "You never did like him, did you?" Jessica murmured, stroking the dog's head. "Matthew said to trust your instincts about people." The next day brought a new development in Jessica's investigation when Eleanor Blackwood shuffled over for their weekly coffee, her arthritic hands clutching a newspaper clipping. "Thought you might find this interesting," the elderly woman said, spreading the clipping on the kitchen table. "From yesterday's Washington Post. Small article, back pages, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it." The headline read, "Pentagon Auditing Weapons Disposal Program After Irregularities." The brief article mentioned an internal investigation into discrepancies in the military's weapons decommissioning protocols, focusing on several bases including Fort Benning, where Matthew had been stationed before his final transfer. "How did you know I'd be interested in this?" Jessica asked carefully, watching Eleanor's lined face. The older woman's eyes, sharp despite her 76 years, met Jessica's directly. "Because I've been watching that Pierce fellow writing down your comings and goings for the past month. And because Frank Wilson's been asking questions about whether you've been going through Matthew's things." She paused. "And because Matthew told me to keep an eye on you and Lily if anything happened to him." Jessica felt the floor shift beneath her. "Matthew told you what?" Eleanor nodded, her weathered hand reaching out to cover Jessica's. "Your husband wasn't just a good soldier," Dear. He was a good man who noticed things others wanted to stay hidden. 3 weeks before he died, he came to see me. Said if anything happened to him, I should watch for certain people showing unusual interest in you and Lily. Why you? Jessica asked, trying to process this revelation. A ghost of a smile crossed Eleanor's face. Because before I was Eleanor Blackwood, gardening enthusiast and widow, I was Captain Eleanor Blackwood, Army Intelligence, retired 30 years now, but Matthew recognized a kindred spirit. We spoke the same language. The revelation of Eleanor's military background explained the older woman's perceptiveness and her immediate understanding of Shadow's training protocols. It also gave Jessica her first true ally in unraveling the mystery Matthew had left behind. "What do you know about Operation Blacksmith?" Jessica asked, lowering her voice despite the fact that they were alone in the house except for Lily, napping upstairs with Shadow standing guard. Only what Matthew shared, which wasn't much. Military protocol, Eleanor replied. He believed someone was diverting weapons marked for destruction to private buyers likely overseas. High-value items that wouldn't be missed once they were listed as destroyed. The kind of operation that would require high-level cooperation and exceptional logistics. Like Frank Wilson's department, Jessica said. Thinking of Matthew's journal entries, Eleanor nodded. Frank oversees equipment disposal and transfer for 3 states. Perfect position for something like this. She hesitated. Jessica, if Matthew was right, this isn't just criminal, it's treasonous. The people involved would do anything to keep it quiet. Including killing an Army lieutenant who was asking too many questions and staging it as a training accident. Jessica finished, the reality of what she was suggesting settling like ice in her stomach. Have you found anything concrete in Matthew's things? Eleanor asked. Anything that would prove what was happening? Jessica thought of the journal upstairs and the key to the safety deposit box she hadn't yet had the courage to visit. Maybe. I'm not sure yet. Eleanor nodded, apparently satisfied with the vague answer. Be careful who you tell. And Jessica, that dog of Matthew's. There's a reason he doesn't trust Daniel Pierce. Military dogs don't forget scents or faces they've been trained to recognize. The implication hung in the air between them. Shadow might recognize Daniel from somewhere connected to Matthew's work. Somewhere a retired DC contractor had no business being. That evening, as Jessica was preparing dinner, Lily playing with wooden blocks on the kitchen floor under Shadow's watchful eye. A silver SUV pulled into their driveway. Shadow was instantly alert, moving to position himself between Lily and the door, but not giving his warning growl. When Jessica peered through the curtains, she recognized Frank Wilson's government-issued vehicle. Perfect timing, Frank called out as she opened the door, holding up a manila envelope. Brought those benefit papers I mentioned. Mind if I come in? Won't take but a minute to explain them. Jessica hesitated. Eleanor's warnings fresh in her mind, but knew that refusing would only increase his suspicions. Of course. We were just about to have dinner. Would you like to join us? Frank's surprise at the invitation was quickly masked with a practiced smile. Don't mind if I do. Been eating bachelor cooking too long. Throughout the simple meal of chicken and vegetables, Jessica maintained a careful facade of grateful military widow while observing Frank's interactions with new awareness. He was particularly interested in Matthew's personal effects, asking seemingly casual questions about what items had been returned from his office and locker. Still can't believe that training malfunction, Frank said, shaking his head as he accepted a second helping. Matthew was always so careful with equipment. Must have been a manufacturer defect in that oxygen regulator. Jessica kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced at this first specific detail about Matthew's supposed accident. Is that what happened? The notification team wasn't very clear about the details. Frank looked momentarily uncomfortable. Classified aspects to the training, of course. But yes, equipment failure. Tragic, preventable. He glanced at Shadow, who had maintained his position beside Lily's high chair throughout the meal, his amber eyes never leaving Frank. Dog still misses him. I see. Shadow's very devoted to us, Jessica replied carefully. Matthew made sure of that. Something flickered in Frank's eyes, calculation. Perhaps. Military working dogs are valuable assets, highly trained. If he ever becomes too much to handle, the unit would gladly take him back, put his skills to good use again. The subtle attempt to separate her from Shadow confirmed Eleanor's warnings about Frank's trustworthiness. That's kind, but Shadow's home is with us. Matthew was very clear about that in his will. After dinner, Frank insisted on helping clear the dishes, using the opportunity to glance through doorways at other rooms in the house. When Jessica returned from putting Lily down for a quick evening nap, she found him in the dining room studying Matthew's journal pages that she'd forgotten to put away. Interesting reading, she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Frank straightened, his expression unreadable. Just noticed Matthew's handwriting, brought back memories. He tapped one of the pages. This looks like his mission notation system. Smart of you to try to organize his thoughts. Any particular reason? Just trying to understand who my husband was? Jessica replied. There's so much about his work I never knew. Frank nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. Military life requires compartmentalization. Matthew was better at it than most. He gathered the benefit papers he'd brought, pointing out signature lines and filing instructions with brisk efficiency. One last thing, Matthew had a personal effects box that wasn't returned to you. Standard procedure to review contents for classified material first. Should be released soon. Anything in particular you're hoping is in there? The casual question carried weight Jessica wouldn't have noticed before Eleanor's revelations. Nothing specific, just anything of him. You know, for Lily's sake, when she's older. After Frank left, Jessica watched his SUV disappear down the driveway, then immediately gathered Matthew's journaled pages and called Eleanor. Wilson just left. He was looking at Matthew's notes, trying to figure out if I know anything. She explained in a rushed whisper. Did he see anything important? Eleanor asked, her voice tense. I don't think so. But he mentioned a personal effects box that's being held for security review, and he specifically mentioned an oxygen regulator malfunction as the cause of Matthew's death. Eleanor was silent for a moment. Jessica, Matthew wasn't involved in any dive training at the time of his death. His last communication with me mentioned meeting an informant about Operation Blacksmith. Whatever happened to him, it had nothing to do with oxygen equipment. The deliberate lie confirmed what Jessica had begun to suspect. Frank Wilson was directly involved in both the weapons smuggling operation and Matthew's death, which raised an urgent question: how much did he suspect she knew? And how far would he go to keep the operation's secrets? That night, as Shadow performed his regular security check of the house, Jessica noticed something she'd previously overlooked. When the shepherd reached the bookshelf in the living room, He paused and pressed his nose against a specific spot on Matthew's old footlocker, which they'd repurposed as a coffee table. Shadow repeated this behavior 3 times before continuing his patrol. Intrigued, Jessica examined the footlocker after Shadow moved on. The dog had been indicating a barely visible seam on what should have been a solid wooden panel. When she pressed it, a small hidden compartment clicked open, revealing a weatherproof case containing a USB drive and a handwritten note in Matthew's handwriting: "Insurance policy. Shadow knows the scent markers." Jessica stared at the USB drive, understanding dawning. Matthew had trained Shadow to identify this hiding spot using scent markers, a technique she'd seen him practice during training exercises. The dog had been trying to show her this hiding place all along, but she hadn't recognized the behavior for what it was. With shaking hands, Jessica connected the drive to her laptop. It contained hundreds of photographs, inventory lists, and video clips, evidence methodically documenting the weapons smuggling operation Matthew had uncovered. Most damning were surveillance photos showing Frank Wilson and several other officers meeting with a civilian who, Jessica realized with a shock, was none other than Daniel Pierce, though in the photos he used a different name. A final video on the drive showed Matthew speaking directly to the camera, his expression grave. "If you're watching this, Jess, then something's happened to me." This evidence proves that Operation Blacksmith is a cover for illegal weapon sales to private military contractors who then sell to restricted countries. Frank Wilson is coordinating from our end. The civilian, James Mercer, who sometimes uses the alias Daniel Pierce, is the broker. There are at least 6 more officers involved. I've sent copies of this evidence to secure locations. But you need to know that these people are dangerous. Shadow has been trained to recognize their scents and will protect you and Lily. I love you both. I'm sorry I won't be coming home. Jessica sat in stunned silence, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Daniel Pierce, or James Mercer, had moved in down the road to monitor her, probably to determine if Matthew had shared his discoveries. The break-in attempt had likely been an effort to find exactly what she'd just discovered. Shadow appeared in the doorway, his body language alert but calm. He padded across the room and pressed his nose against Jessica's hand, then looked pointedly at the screen where Matthew's frozen image remained. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Jessica whispered, burying her fingers in the thick fur at Shadow's neck. "That's why you never trusted Daniel. You recognized his scent from Matthew's training." Shadow's amber eyes held hers, intelligent and unwavering. In that moment, Jessica understood that the dog wasn't just following Matthew's final order. He was honoring a promise made between soldiers. A promise that transcended species and spoke to a loyalty deeper than words could express. With this evidence, Jessica now faced a critical decision. Who could she trust to help her expose the truth without putting herself and Lily in even greater danger? The journey to Matthew's parents' home in rural Pennsylvania should have been routine, a 5-hour drive Jessica had made countless times before. But this trip, hastily arranged after discovering the USB drive's contents, carried the weight of both revelation and danger. She'd called her in-laws the night before, fabricating a story about needing a break from the memories haunting their Virginia farmhouse. Their eager response, they missed Lily desperately, and worried constantly about Jessica's isolation, made the deception easier to bear. "We should reach Grandma and Grandpa's before dinner," Jessica told Lily, who was securely fastened in her car seat, clutching the stuffed rabbit Matthew had given her before his final deployment. Shadow sat in the rear cargo area of Jessica's SUV, his massive frame taking up the entire space. Amber eyes constantly scanning the road behind them through the rear window. Jessica had prepared meticulously for their departure, waiting until she spotted Daniel Pierce driving away from his house. Then, loading the car in under 10 minutes with bags she'd packed the night before. The USB drive was secured in a waterproof pouch around her neck, hidden beneath her shirt. 3 copies had been made, one mailed to a lawyer Matthew had trusted, one hidden in Eleanor's garden shed, and one stored in a password-protected cloud account Jessica had created using a library computer. "Eleanor knows what to do if we don't check in," she told Shadow as they pulled out of the driveway at dawn. The dog had acknowledged her words with a soft huff, as if confirming the mission parameters. They were 2 hours into the journey, passing through the rolling farmland of northern Virginia, when Jessica first noticed the black sedan. At first, it was just another vehicle on the interstate, maintaining a consistent 4-car distance behind them. But after Jessica's third-lane change in 15 minutes, a deliberate pattern to test her suspicion, the sedan mirrored her movements exactly. "We've got company," she murmured. Glancing in the rearview mirror, Shadow had already noticed, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert, ears forward and body tense. Jessica's mind raced through options. She couldn't outrun a professional tail, not with Lily in the car. Calling the police would mean stopping somewhere, making them vulnerable. And what would she say? "I'm being followed because my dead husband uncovered an international weapons smuggling operation," without context. She'd sound paranoid at best, delusional at worst. Instead, she took the next exit, a rural highway that led toward the Shenandoah Valley rather than north to Pennsylvania. If they were indeed being followed, she'd rather confront the situation away from the high-speed interstate. Somewhere she could control more variables. The sedan followed, now making no attempt to disguise its pursuit. "Change your plans, sweetie?" Jessica called back to Lily, keeping her voice cheerful despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Let's find a place for an early lunch." She spotted a busy gas station with an attached diner just ahead, plenty of witnesses, security cameras, multiple exits. Perfect. Jessica pulled into the crowded parking lot, choosing a spot near the front entrance where the morning sun glinted off the large windows, providing clear visibility from inside the building. The black sedan cruised slowly past the gas station before parking at the far end of the lot. Jessica watched in the side mirror as a man in a dark jacket and baseball cap emerged, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He wasn't Frank Wilson or Daniel Pierce, but his military bearing was unmistakable, the same controlled economy of movement she'd observed in Matthew and his colleagues. "Stay," she commanded Shadow as she unbuckled Lily from her car seat. The dog whined softly but remained in position, understanding that his presence would draw unwanted attention. "Guard the car." Inside the bright diner, Jessica selected a booth with clear sight lines to both her vehicle and the entrance, settling Lily with crayons and a paper placemat. She ordered quickly a coffee for herself, chocolate milk for Lily while keeping her phone in hand, Eleanor's number ready to dial. The man from the sedan entered 3 minutes later, scanning the diner methodically before spotting Jessica, rather than approaching directly. He took a seat at the counter, his position allowing him to watch her in the large mirror behind the server station. Their eyes met briefly in the reflection, and the man nodded once, a gesture that sent ice through Jessica's veins. Not threatening, exactly, but acknowledging that they both knew the game being played. Jessica's phone vibrated with an incoming text from an unknown number. "Need to talk about Matthew. Not safe here. Too many watching." She stared at the message, then glanced up at the man, who now held his own phone visible just long enough for her to make the connection. A server placed a mug of coffee before him, and he leaned forward to add cream, using the movement to speak quietly to the server while gesturing subtly toward Jessica. The young waitress nodded and approached Jessica's table. "Ma'am, there's a call for you at the register," she said, looking slightly confused. "Guy says he's your brother and it's a family emergency." Jessica hesitated. Years of military spouse training, screaming warnings about separation tactics. "I need to take my daughter with me." "Of course," the waitress agreed, stepping back. At the register, the manager handed her a landline phone with a sympathetic expression. "Hope everything's okay. Your brother sounds pretty upset." Jessica pressed the receiver to her ear, keeping Lily balanced on her hip and her eyes on the man at the counter. "Hello, Mrs. Anderson. Please listen carefully," said a voice she didn't recognize. "My name is Captain Robert Hayes. I served with Matthew in Afghanistan before he transferred to intelligence. I don't have much time. The man at the counter is with me. But we're not the only ones watching you. There's a gray Suburban that followed your tail, and they're not friendly." Jessica's eyes darted to the parking lot, where she could indeed see a gray Suburban now parked 3 spaces from her SUV. Shadow was clearly visible through the window, his attention fixed on the new vehicle, body tense and ready. "How do I know I can trust you?" Jessica demanded quietly. "Matthew called me 2 days before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should watch for unusual interest in his family. Said his dog would recognize friend from foe." There was a pause. "Operation Blacksmith goes higher than Wilson, much higher. The evidence Matthew collected puts you and your daughter in serious danger." Jessica watched as 2 men emerged from the Suburban, moving with casual purpose toward her vehicle. Shadow's hackles were visibly raised, even from this distance. "Those men are going to try to search your car," Hayes continued urgently. "Whatever evidence you have, they know you have it. We need to get you somewhere secure to figure out next steps." "My dog won't let them near the car," Jessica said, decision crystallizing. "And I'm not going anywhere with someone I don't know." "Understood," Hayes replied, his tone shifting to one of professional respect. "But we need to move. Now. Take your daughter to the restroom at the back of the diner. There's a service exit that leads to the delivery area. My colleague will create a distraction. Get to your vehicle and drive north on Route 11. We'll intercept and escort you to a safe location." The line went dead as one of the men from the Suburban reached Jessica's SUV, testing the door handle. Shadow lunged against the window with a bark that was visible rather than audible through the glass, causing the man to jump back. The second man reached inside his jacket, his intention clear. "Lily, we need to use the potty." "Okay," Jessica said calmly, already moving toward the back of the diner, calculating angles and timing. Her military spouse, training all those years of contingency planning and threat assessment that had seemed paranoid to her civilian friends, now guided her movements with instinctive precision. The women's restroom was empty, its small window too narrow for an adult, but offering a clear view of the delivery area behind the diner. As Jessica lifted Lily to wash her hands, a commotion erupted in the main dining room, raised voices, the crash of breaking dishes, the distraction Hayes had promised. Jessica slipped through the service exit into the bright morning sunshine of the delivery area. No vehicles blocked their path to the side of the building, which would allow them to approach their SUV from the blind side of the Suburban. She hurried Lily along, murmuring encouragement and keeping her body between the child and any potential threat. As they rounded the corner of the building, Jessica saw that the situation in the parking lot had escalated dramatically. The man in the baseball cap, Hayes's colleague, was now engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument with the two men from the Suburban, their confrontation drawing the attention of other patrons and the gas station attendant. More importantly, the men's position now blocked their direct line of sight to Jessica's SUV. "We're going for a fast drive, sweetie," Jessica told Lily as they approached the vehicle. "Shadow's going to sit up front with me, and I need you to be my brave girl." Shadow recognized their approach immediately, his barking shifting from warning to recognition. As Jessica unlocked the vehicle and quickly secured Lily in her car seat, the shepherd leapt into the front passenger seat, his body tense but controlled, waiting for commands. Jessica started the engine and reversed smoothly, using the row of parked cars to shield their exit from the men's view. By the time one of them noticed and shouted, pointing in her direction, she was already accelerating onto Route 11, heading north as Hayes had instructed. In the rear-view mirror, she saw the man in the baseball cap break away from the confrontation and sprint to the black sedan. The Suburban's occupants scrambled to their vehicle, but the baseball cap man had positioned his argument in a way that partially blocked their access, giving Jessica precious seconds of lead time. "Good boy," she told Shadow, who sat alertly in the passenger seat. His gaze divided between the road ahead and the mirrors showing what pursued them. "We just need to reach Hayes, and then we'll get some answers." Jessica pushed the SUV to its limits on the rural highway, weaving through sparse traffic while keeping a white-knuckled grip on the wheel. Lily, sensing the tension, remained unusually quiet in her car seat, clutching her rabbit. The black sedan appeared in her rearview mirror within minutes, maintaining a steady distance, not attempting to overtake them, but clearly escorting. The Suburban was nowhere to be seen. After 10 miles of tense driving, Jessica's phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. "Unknown number. Take the next right onto Creek Bridge Road," Hayes's voice instructed without preamble. "Drive exactly 4.7 miles. There's an abandoned fire station on the left. Pull in behind the building." "The Suburban?" Jessica asked tersely. "Delayed." "My colleague had the foresight to slash a tire during the distraction, but they'll have called for backup. We don't have much time." Jessica followed the instructions, turning onto a narrow country road that wound through dense forest. Shadow's posture relaxed slightly as the black sedan maintained its consistent distance behind them, suggesting the dog recognized something familiar or trustworthy about their pursuer. The abandoned fire station appeared exactly where Hayes had said it would, its red brick facade faded and partially obscured by overgrown vegetation. Jessica pulled around to the rear as instructed, where a modern blue pickup truck was already parked. A tall man in civilian clothes stood beside it, presumably Hayes, his posture military straight, despite the casual attire. As Jessica parked and reached for her door, Shadow gave a soft whine, not his warning sound, but the inquisitive noise he made when encountering something familiar. The black sedan pulled in behind them, and the man in the baseball cap emerged quickly, joining Hayes by the pickup. "Mrs. Anderson," Hayes said, as Jessica cautiously exited her vehicle, keeping the door open so Shadow could intervene if necessary. "Thank you for trusting us this far. I served with Matthew in the 10th Mountain Division before he transferred to intelligence. This is Specialist Morris, who worked directly with Matthew on Operation Blacksmith before your husband discovered the irregularities." Shadow's reaction was Jessica's most reliable indicator. The shepherd studied both men intently, nostrils flaring as he processed their scents. After a tense moment, his posture relaxed, not completely, but enough that Jessica felt her own shoulders lower slightly. "You said Operation Blacksmith goes higher than Wilson?" Jessica said, keeping one hand on Shadow's back. "How much do you know about what Matthew found?" Hayes glanced at the sky, then at his watch. "Enough to know that you and your daughter need immediate protection. Those men at the gas station work for Assistant Director Chambers at the Defense Logistics Agency, Wilson's boss, and the primary architect of the weapons diversion scheme. If they're moving this openly against you, it means they know Matthew left evidence behind, and they believe you have it." "What evidence?" Jessica asked carefully, testing their knowledge and intentions. Morris spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. Lieutenant Anderson documented weapons shipments being diverted from destruction protocols to private military contractors. Specifically, next-generation prototype weapons that were supposed to be destroyed after testing failed. Instead, they were sold to foreign buyers through a broker named James Mercer, who's been operating under various aliases, including Daniel Pierce, Jessica finished, her suspicion easing slightly at this confirmation of what she already knew. Hayes nodded grimly. "Matthew contacted me 3 days before his death, said he had concrete evidence and was planning to approach the Inspector General. He never made it to that meeting." "Why should I trust you?" Jessica asked bluntly. "For all I know, you could be part of this too." Hayes reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew a battered challenge coin, the same distinctive unit coin Matthew had carried throughout his service. "Your husband gave me this when I saved his life in Kandahar. Said someday he'd return the favor. I couldn't save him, but I can try to protect what he loved most." The personal detail, one that wouldn't appear in any official record, combined with Shadow's relaxed assessment, tipped the balance in Jessica's decision-making. "We need to get to my in-laws in Pennsylvania," she said firmly. "Matthew's father is a retired federal judge with security connections. If anyone can help us navigate this legally and safely, it's him." Hayes exchanged a glance with Morris before nodding. "We'll escort you there, but we need to move quickly. Those men will have called in your vehicle description and direction of travel by now." As they prepared to depart, Morris would drive Jessica's SUV while she and Lily rode with Hayes in the more anonymous pickup. Shadow maintaining his protective position, Jessica felt the first glimmer of hope since discovering Matthew's hidden evidence. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore, and perhaps justice for Matthew was within reach. What she couldn't know was that their journey to Pennsylvania would become the most dangerous 5 hours of her life. The call about Frank Wilson came as they crossed the Maryland state line, 3 hours into their journey toward the relative safety of the Anderson family compound in rural Pennsylvania. Hayes's secure phone buzzed with a message that made his weathered face grow grim as he passed it to Jessica in the passenger seat. "Frank Wilson was found dead in his home office an hour ago," he said quietly, mindful of Lily sleeping in her car seat behind them. "Gunshot wound to the head. They're calling it suicide." Jessica stared at the message, processing its implications while Shadow, wedged protectively between Lily's car seat and the door, raised his head attentively as if sensing the shift in emotional temperature. "Suicide," she repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. Like the 3 other officers Matthew mentioned in his notes who supposedly killed themselves after raising concerns about inventory discrepancies, Hayes nodded, his eyes never leaving the road as their small convoy, his pickup followed by Morris driving Jessica's SUV, navigated the increasingly mountainous terrain. Classic containment protocol. Wilson was the operational manager, but he was ultimately expendable if the larger operation was threatened. "They're cleaning house," Jessica said softly. The reality of what they were facing settling into her bones like a deep chill. Frank Wilson may have been complicit in Matthew's death, but his own elimination confirmed the ruthless efficiency of the organization they were up against. The rain began shortly after they received the news about Wilson, a gentle mist at first that gradually intensified into sheets of water that reduced visibility to mere yards. Hayes maintained a steady pace, his military precision evident in every adjustment to the increasingly hazardous conditions. "We should reach your in-laws' place before nightfall," he said, wiping condensation from the inside of the windshield. "Judge Anderson's property has good natural defenses, single-access road, clear sight lines, defensible positions. Morris and I can set up a secure perimeter while you make arrangements for the evidence to reach the proper authorities." Jessica nodded, her attention divided between the treacherous road ahead and periodic checks on Lily and Shadow in the back seat. The shepherd had settled into a vigilant rest, his body curled protectively around Lily's car seat. But his eyes remained alert, occasionally scanning the road behind them through the rain-streaked windows. They were passing through a particularly remote stretch of highway, the forested mountains pressing close on either side. When Hayes suddenly tensed, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror. "We've got company," he said calmly, the professional soldier's discipline evident in his measured tone. Black Suburban, coming up fast behind Morris. Different vehicle than at the gas station, but same model. Jessica turned to look through the rain-lashed rear window, where she could just make out the hulking shape of a vehicle bearing down on her SUV, its headlights on high beam despite the daylight. Morris had clearly noticed their pursuer as well, his driving becoming more defensive as he maintained position behind Hayes's pickup. "How did they find us?" Jessica asked, instinctively reaching back to place a reassuring hand on Lily's leg. "Could be a number of ways," Hayes replied, accelerating slightly as the road curved around the mountainside. "Your vehicle might have a tracker installed, standard procedure for some military families, supposedly for safety, or they've coordinated with local law enforcement to watch major routes north. Either way, we need to create distance." The radio crackled as Morris's voice came through the secure channel Hayes had established. "2 more vehicles joining the primary pursuit. Black sedans, government issue by the look of them. They're moving to flank positions." Hayes's expression hardened as he assessed their rapidly deteriorating situation. "Mrs. Anderson, there's a go bag under your seat with emergency supplies. If we get separated, your priority is to reach your father-in-law's property. The coordinates are programmed into the satellite phone inside." Jessica retrieved the heavy canvas bag, her hands moving with the calm efficiency that years as a military spouse had ingrained in her. Inside she found the promised satellite phone, energy bars, water, a first aid kit, and a sealed envelope with her name written in block letters. "Matthew prepared that," Hayes explained, seeing her confusion. "Left it with me after your daughter was born. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got it." Before Jessica could process this new revelation, the world around them exploded into chaos. The Suburban behind Morris had accelerated suddenly, ramming the back of Jessica's SUV with enough force to send it fishtailing on the rain-slicked pavement. Morris fought for control, nearly recovering before a second impact sent the vehicle spinning toward the guardrail separating the highway from a steep wooded slope. "Hold on," Hayes shouted, braking hard and executing a precise defensive maneuver that brought their pickup facing the oncoming pursuit vehicles. Shadow was fully alert now, his powerful body tense as he positioned himself more completely around Lily, who had awakened and begun to cry in confusion and fear. Jessica watched in horror as her SUV, with Morris fighting the wheel, crashed through the guardrail and began to tumble down the steep embankment, rolling at least twice before disappearing into the dense foliage below. The pursuing Suburban skidded to a stop, two men in tactical gear emerging with weapons visible in their hands. "We can't help him now," Hayes said grimly, throwing the pickup into reverse and executing a rapid J-turn that pointed them away from the approaching threat. "Our priority is your daughter's safety." The pickup's engine roared as Hayes pushed it to its limits, navigating the treacherous mountain road with the skill of someone who had driven under fire before. Jessica clutched the overhead handle with one hand while reaching back to steady Lily's car seat with the other, murmuring reassurances that felt hollow even as she spoke them. They had put nearly a mile between themselves and the crash site when the sound of an approaching helicopter cut through the drumming rain, its spotlight sweeping the road ahead. "Government resources," Hayes noted, his tone clinically detached even as he guided the truck onto a barely visible fire road that branched from the main highway. "This isn't just a cleanup operation anymore. They're treating this like a high-priority national security threat." The pickup lurched and bounced along the muddy track, branches scraping against the windows as they pushed deeper into the forest. The helicopter's sound faded temporarily, but Jessica harbored no illusions that they had escaped. They had merely bought time. The fire road ended abruptly at what had once been a small quarry, now filled with rainwater that reflected the gray sky above. Hayes killed the engine and turned to face Jessica, his expression grim but determined. "We need to split up," he said, already reaching for his go-bag. "They'll expect us to stay with the vehicle. You and Lily need to continue on foot to these coordinates." He pointed to a location on a weatherproof map. "There's an old hunting cabin about 3 miles from here. It's stocked with emergency supplies. Wait there for 6 hours. If I don't arrive, use the satellite phone to call the number labeled Protocol 7. Jessica stared at him, the full magnitude of their situation crashing down on her. 3 miles through the mountains in this weather, with a toddler. Hayes's expression softened slightly. "The dog will help. Military working dogs are trained for terrain navigation, and you're stronger than you think. Mrs. Anderson, Matthew always said so." The mention of her husband steadied Jessica's resolve. She secured Lily in the child carrier from her go-bag, adjusting the straps to distribute the weight evenly across her shoulders and hips. Shadow watched the process intently, his posture communicating readiness. "What about Morris?" she asked, thinking of the man who had been driving her vehicle. Hayes's face revealed nothing. "If he survived, he knows the protocols. We proceed as trained." He handed her a small pouch. "This contains a scent marker. Shadow will recognize it from his training with Matthew. It will help him find the cabin." As Jessica prepared to set out, Hayes gripped her shoulder firmly. "Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Anderson. One of the best I've served with. What he discovered what you're carrying could expose corruption at the highest levels of military procurement. People have died for less." "I know," Jessica replied, checking Lily's rain protection one final time. "That's why we have to make it. The rain had settled into a steady downpour as Jessica stepped away from the relative shelter of the pickup. Lily, secure in the carrier on her back, and Shadow alert at her side. The shepherd seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, staying close without needing commands, his powerful body occasionally pressing against her legs when the muddy ground threatened her balance. They had been hiking for perhaps 20 minutes, following a deer trail that roughly aligned with Hayes's coordinates, when the distant sound of the helicopter returned, accompanied by the more immediate crack of gunfire echoing from the direction of the quarry. "Hayes," Jessica whispered, instinctively ducking lower though the forest canopy already shielded them from aerial observation. Shadow whined softly, pressing closer to Jessica's side as Lily began to cry, disturbed by the sudden noises and her mother's tension. Jessica fought to maintain her composure, knowing that panic would only endanger them further. "It's okay, sweetie," she murmured, reaching awkwardly behind her to pat Lily's leg. "We're playing a special hiding game. Shadow is helping us hide." At the mention of his name, the shepherd looked up at Jessica, his amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that transcended species. In that moment, Jessica realized that the dog understood far more than she had previously credited, not just commands and routines, but the stakes of their current situation and his role as protector. "Find safe," Jessica said clearly, holding out the scent marker Hayes had given her. It wasn't an official command from Shadow's training, but the dog immediately sniffed the marker and then raised his head, nostrils flaring as he processed the scents carried on the damp air. After a moment's consideration, Shadow adjusted their course slightly, leading them deeper into the forest with a confidence that Jessica could only trust was based on more than animal instinct. As they moved further from the sounds of pursuit, the rain intensified, soaking through Jessica's supposedly waterproof jacket and making the steep terrain treacherously slippery. The fall happened so quickly that Jessica barely had time to register the sensation of her foot sliding out from under her on a mud-slick rock. She twisted desperately as she went down, managing to land on her side rather than her back where Lily was secured. But the impact still drove the breath from her lungs and sent a bolt of pain through her ankle. For a moment, she lay stunned in the mud, rain pelting her face as Lily wailed in fear and confusion. Shadow was instantly at her side, nudging her face with his muzzle, his eyes conveying an almost human concern. "I'm okay," Jessica gasped, though the sharp pain when she tried to stand suggested otherwise. She managed to struggle to a seated position, checking that Lily was unharmed before examining her own injury. Her ankle wasn't broken, she could put weight on it, but the rapidly swelling tissue indicated a serious sprain at minimum. 3 miles through mountain terrain had been challenging before. Now it seemed nearly impossible. But the alternative capture by the people who had already killed Matthew and likely Hayes as well was unthinkable. "We keep going," Jessica told Shadow, using his solid frame to help herself stand. "We just keep going." Shadow found the hunting cabin as darkness settled over the mountains. The structure emerged from the mist like something from another era, a simple one-room shelter built of weathered logs with a small covered porch and shuttered windows. Under different circumstances, it might have appeared quaint. Now, it represented their only hope for survival. Jessica had been walking on sheer determination for the last mile, her injured ankle screaming with each step, Lily's weight on her back feeling heavier with every passing minute. The toddler had mercifully fallen asleep despite the jostling journey, her small body warm against Jessica's rain-soaked back. Shadow had remained vigilant throughout their trek, occasionally ranging ahead to scout the path, but always returning to Jessica's side when the terrain grew particularly challenging, somehow understanding when she needed his solid frame to lean against. The cabin door was secured with a simple padlock that yielded to the key Hayes had included with the map. Jessica stumbled inside, the sudden absence of rain striking her as profound as she carefully lowered Lily to the single narrow cot along one wall. Shadow performed an immediate perimeter check of the small space, inspecting corners, windows, the small bathroom alcove before positioning himself by the door, shaking his wet coat, and then settling with his eyes fixed on the entrance. "Good boy," Jessica whispered, her voice rough from exertion and unshed tears. "The best boy." The cabin was sparsely furnished but well stocked for emergencies: a propane heater, lanterns, dried food, bottled water, and a comprehensive first aid kit. Jessica's military spouse training took over, establishing a secure environment with mechanical precision despite her exhaustion. She treated her ankle with practiced efficiency, wrapping it tightly with an elastic bandage and elevating it on a folded blanket. Only when Lily was dry, warm, and still sleeping peacefully did Jessica allow herself to truly feel the gravity of their situation. Morris was likely dead. Hayes had almost certainly sacrificed himself to buy them time. And she was now alone in the wilderness with a toddler, an injured ankle, and evidence that powerful people were willing to kill to suppress. The satellite phone felt heavy in her hands as she powered it on, the small screen casting an eerie blue glow in the dimly lit cabin. The number Hayes had labeled Protocol 7 connected after 2 rings. But no one spoke on the other end. "This is Jessica Anderson," she said softly, mindful of Lily sleeping nearby. "Captain Hayes instructed me to call this number. We're at the designated location." After a long pause, a woman's voice responded, clinical and precise. "Authentication required." Jessica hesitated, her mind racing through her conversations with Hayes. Then she remembered the envelope he'd given her in the truck, the one Matthew had left for her. She tore it open with trembling fingers, finding a single sheet of paper with Matthew's handwriting. "Jess, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're in danger. The authentication phrase is 'Sunflowers bloom at midnight.' The evidence I've gathered is now your burden. I'm sorry for that. Know that I love you and Lily more than anything in this world. Trust Shadow. He'll protect you both with his life, just as I would have. Always. M." Jessica's throat tightened as she read her husband's final message, his voice so clear in her mind that for a moment it felt as though he were in the room with her. She took a steadying breath and spoke into the phone. "Sunflowers bloom at midnight. Authentication accepted," the woman replied, her tone warming slightly. "Mrs. Anderson, we've been monitoring the situation." "Your position is secure for now, but you need to remain in place. Extraction team will arrive at 0600 hours. "Who are you?" Jessica asked, caution overriding relief. "How do I know I can trust you?" "My name is Director Catherine Emerson, Office of Special Investigations. I was Lieutenant Anderson's control officer for Operation Blacksmith." The woman paused. "Your husband was working with us to expose the weapons diversion scheme. He wasn't just a whistleblower, Mrs. Anderson. He was an undercover investigator." The revelation hit Jessica like a physical blow. Matthew hadn't just stumbled upon corruption, he had been deliberately investigating it, putting himself in harm's way knowingly. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. operational security, plausible deniability, protection. Lieutenant Anderson insisted on keeping you and your daughter isolated from his work. Director Emerson confirmed, for your safety. What he discovered went beyond simple corruption. The weapons being diverted were prototype systems that could fundamentally alter certain regional conflicts if they fell into the wrong hands. The people involved have connections throughout the military and intelligence communities. Frank Wilson is dead, Jessica said. They're calling it suicide. We know, Emerson replied grimly. Wilson was about to break. He'd reached out to us yesterday, asking for protection in exchange for testimony. We were too late. A sudden noise outside the cabin brought Shadow to his feet, a low growl building in his throat. Jessica immediately disconnected the call and extinguished the lantern, moving silently to Lily's side despite the pain in her ankle. Shadow positioned himself between the door and Jessica, his posture communicating clear threat assessment. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet, the normal chorus of night insects suddenly silent. Jessica strained to hear past the sound of her own breathing, catching the faint crunch of careful footsteps on the gravel path leading to the cabin. Shadow's growl deepened, the sound barely audible but felt through the floorboards. Jessica reached for the go-bag, her hand closing around the only weapon Hayes had provided, a heavy flashlight that could double as a baton if necessary. A pathetically inadequate defense, but better than nothing. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the small porch. A long moment of silence followed, broken only by Lily's soft breathing and the distant patter of rain on the cabin roof. Then, unexpectedly, a familiar voice called out, "Mrs. Anderson, it's Eleanor Blackwood. I'm alone and unarmed." Shadow's reaction was immediate and confusing. His threatening posture relaxed slightly, but he remained positioned protectively, clearly uncertain about this new development. Jessica approached the door cautiously, keeping to the side of the window as she peered through a gap in the curtains. Eleanor Blackwood stood on the porch, her small frame dwarfed by a heavy raincoat, her white hair plastered to her skull by the persistent drizzle. She looked exhausted but determined, her hands visible and empty at her sides. "How did you find us?" Jessica called through the door, not yet reaching for the lock. "Matthew showed me this place years ago," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the cold and wet. "When he first started investigating Operation Blacksmith, said if anything happened to him, and you disappeared, this would be the fallback position." The information was specific enough to be credible. Hayes couldn't have known about Matthew showing Eleanor this location, but Jessica remained cautious. "Shadow," she commanded softly. "Check." Understanding the instruction, the shepherd approached the door, sniffing intently at the crack beneath it. After a moment's consideration, his posture relaxed fully, and he looked back at Jessica with what could only be described as confirmation. Jessica opened the door, tension draining from her shoulders as Eleanor stepped inside, bringing the scent of rain and pine needles with her. Shadow greeted the older woman with a gentle nudge of his nose against her hand, a clear sign of recognition and acceptance. "You're hurt," Eleanor observed immediately, noting Jessica's wrapped ankle and the way she favored her right leg. "Slipped in the mud," Jessica explained, securing the door behind Eleanor. "How did you know to come here? What's happening back home?" Eleanor removed her sodden raincoat, hanging it carefully by the door before taking a seat at the small table. Her movements were precise and efficient despite her age, reinforcing Jessica's understanding that there was far more to her elderly neighbor than had been apparent all these years. After you left this morning, Daniel Pierce or James Mercer, whatever his real name is, came to your house looking for you. When he realized you were gone, he was agitated. Eleanor's expression hardened. I played the confused old lady, but I could see he was mobilizing resources, military-grade communications, multiple vehicles. Whatever you found, Jessica, it spooked them badly. I have evidence of everything, Jessica confirmed, retrieving the USB drive from around her neck. Matthew documented the entire operation, weapons that were supposed to be destroyed being diverted to private buyers, senior military officers involved. Everything. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Matthew was thorough. It's what made him both an excellent intelligence officer and a dangerous enemy to these people. She hesitated. I contacted some old colleagues, people from my time in Army intelligence, who aren't connected to current operations. They confirmed that a full-scale manhunt has been authorized for you under the pretext of national security. The official story is that you stole classified information after your husband's death. They're going to paint me as a traitor. Jessica realized, the cruel logic of it clear. Discredit anything I might reveal. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. And with Frank Wilson dead, they've eliminated the most obvious link to the operation. The remaining conspirators are insulated by layers of bureaucracy and plausible deniability. Shadow had returned to his position by the door, but his alertness had shifted to a more relaxed vigilance, suggesting he perceived no immediate threat. Lily still slept peacefully, exhausted from their arduous journey. I spoke to someone named Director Emerson, Jessica said. She claims Matthew was working with her office all along, that he was an undercover investigator, not just someone who stumbled onto corruption. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. Catherine Emerson. She's still active. The older woman seemed genuinely surprised. She was legendary in counterintelligence circles even in my day. If she was Matthew's control, then this goes much deeper than I thought. She's sending an extraction team, Jessica explained. Supposed to arrive at 0600. Eleanor checked her watch with a frown. That's 6 hours from now. Too long. Mercer's people were mobilizing tracking teams with thermal imaging when I left. Military contractors with specialized equipment. They'll find this place by dawn. The news sent a chill through Jessica. Then what do? We get ahead of their narrative, Eleanor said firmly, producing a satellite phone different from the one Hayes had provided. I have contacts at the Washington Post people who can't be easily silenced or bought off. We send them the evidence now, with enough context that if anything happens to you or Lily, it only confirms the story rather than burying it. The plan made strategic sense, but Jessica hesitated, thinking of the immediate danger it might create. Won't that just make us more expendable once the evidence is out? Perhaps, Eleanor acknowledged. But it also creates witnesses and public attention that makes simply eliminating you much more complicated. She reached across the table to grip Jessica's hand, her paper-thin skin covering surprisingly strong fingers. Matthew trusted you with this for a reason, Jessica. He knew you had the strength to see it through. The conversation was interrupted by Shadow's sudden shift in posture, not the aggressive stance from earlier, but an alert attentiveness directed at the cabin's rear window. Both women fell silent, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. A soft scraping noise came from the back of the cabin, too deliberate to be a branch in the wind. Shadow moved silently to the rear window, his hackles rising as he stared into the darkness beyond the glass. "They've found us," Eleanor whispered, her expression grim as she reached into her raincoat pocket and withdrew a small pistol, a revelation that momentarily shocked Jessica before the immediate danger reasserted itself. "There's a root cellar," Eleanor continued, moving toward Lily with surprising speed for her age. "Trap door under the rug by the fireplace. Matthew showed me. Get Lily down there while I cover the windows." Jessica didn't waste time questioning how her elderly neighbor had come armed to a remote cabin in the mountains. The strange layers of secret knowledge and hidden capabilities that had defined the last week of her life had fundamentally altered her capacity for surprise. Instead, she focused on the immediate task protecting Lily. The trapdoor was exactly where Eleanor had indicated, concealed beneath a faded rug and leading to a small earthen cellar that smelled of damp soil and stored apples. Jessica carefully lowered the still sleeping Lily onto the dry blankets that lined one corner, then turned to call Shadow down with them. To her surprise, the shepherd refused to follow. Instead, returning to his position by the rear window, body tense and focused on the threat outside. In that moment, Jessica understood with painful clarity that Shadow had made a tactical decision. He would not retreat to safety while danger approached. He would stand his ground, fulfilling the mission Matthew had given him to protect his family at all costs. "Shadow, come," Jessica whispered more urgently, fear clutching at her heart. The dog glanced back at her, his amber eyes reflecting a decision already made, before returning his attention to the window. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder. "He knows what he's doing," the older woman said softly. "He's buying us time." 3 months after the events at the hunting cabin, Jessica Anderson stood on the manicured lawn of Arlington National Cemetery, watching as the honor guard folded the flag with precise, white-gloved movements. The late October sun cast long shadows across the rows of headstones, the air crisp with the promise of approaching winter. Lily, solemn in her small black dress, held tightly to Jessica's hand, while Shadow sat at perfect attention beside them, his posture military straight despite the fresh scar that ran along his left flank. The posthumous silver star gleamed on the polished wood of the display case, awarded to Lieutenant Matthew Anderson for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an opposing armed force. The official citation carefully omitted specific details about Operation Blacksmith, but the presence of several high-ranking officials from the Department of Defense spoke volumes about the impact of Matthew's final mission. "Your husband would be proud," whispered Eleanor Blackwood, standing on Jessica's other side, looking every bit the retired schoolteacher rather than the former intelligence officer who had helped expose one of the largest weapons diversion schemes in military history. "Of all of this, but especially of you." Jessica nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat as the commander of the honor guard approached, presenting her with the folded flag. "On behalf of a grateful nation," he intoned, the ritualized words carrying new meaning after all they had endured. The ceremony concluded with a 3-volley salute that made Shadow's ears twitch. though he remained steadfastly in position, the specially designed service dog vest with Matthew's unit patch displayed prominently on his chest. The Department of Veterans Affairs had officially recognized Shadow as a service animal for Lily, whose pediatrician had diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder following the events at the cabin. The bureaucratic designation was merely formality. Shadow had appointed himself Lily's guardian long before any paperwork made it official. As the attendees dispersed, Director Catherine Emerson approached, her civilian clothes doing nothing to diminish her air of authority. "Mrs. Anderson," she said with a respectful nod. "The final arrests were made this morning. Assistant Director Chambers and 3 other senior officials. With their cooperation, we've traced the weapons that were already sold and initiated recovery operations." "And Daniel Pierce?" Jessica asked, though she already knew the answer. Pierce, or James Mercer, as he was identified in the federal indictment, had been the first to fall after the Washington Post published their explosive exposé based on Matthew's evidence. His attempted flight to a non-extradition country had ended at Dulles International Airport, with federal agents waiting at the gate. Facing multiple life sentences, Emerson confirmed. His testimony has been particularly valuable in identifying the foreign buyers. Jessica accepted this information with a nod, finding that vengeance offered less satisfaction than she had imagined. No conviction would bring Matthew back or erase the trauma of that night at the cabin when Shadow had alerted them to Daniel Pierce's approach moments before the man would have discovered their hiding place. The confrontation that followed still visited Jessica's dreams. Eleanor's steady hand with the pistol forcing Pierce to drop his weapon. Shadow's unwavering position between Pierce and the trapdoor where Lily and Jessica hid. The tense standoff broken by the arrival of Director Emerson's extraction team. Alerted by the emergency signal Eleanor had triggered. Pierce's expression when he realized his operation had been exposed and his future destroyed remained etched in Jessica's memory, not for its satisfaction, but for the hollow recognition that even his complete downfall couldn't restore what had been taken from them. The Anderson family home had been sold, too laden with memories and security concerns to remain viable. Judge Anderson Matthews' father had insisted that Jessica and Lily move into the guest house on his Pennsylvania estate, an arrangement that provided both security and family support as they rebuilt their lives. Shadow, naturally, had made the transition with them, establishing new patrol routes and security protocols for their new home with methodical dedication. As the cemetery emptied and they walked slowly back to the waiting car, Lily suddenly stopped, pointing to a bench beneath a spreading oak tree. "Daddy sat there," she said with the simple certainty of a child. Jessica followed her daughter's gaze, seeing only an empty bench. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "When Shadow got hurt," Lily explained, her small face serious. "Daddy sat there and told Shadow to stay with us. I heard him." Jessica exchanged a glance with Eleanor, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Shadow had indeed been injured during the confrontation at the cabin, a knife wound along his flank that would have been fatal if Pierce's aim had been slightly more accurate. The shepherd had continued defending them despite the injury, placing himself repeatedly between Pierce and Lily until help arrived. "I believe you," Jessica said simply, kneeling to meet her daughter's eyes. Some mysteries, she had learned, didn't require explanation. That evening, back at the Anderson estate, Jessica sat on the porch swing watching Lily and Shadow play in the fading light. The shepherd, despite his years and injuries, patiently engaged in a game of fetch, never straying far from the little girl who now represented his entire world. At precisely 600 p.m., the time Matthew had always returned home when he wasn't deployed. Shadow paused in his play to look toward the long driveway, a habit he had maintained despite the months that had passed. Jessica fingered the envelope she'd found that morning while unpacking the last of their belongings, a final letter from Matthew she hadn't known existed, hidden in Shadow's old training manual. Inside was a simple note. "When you read this, the worst will be over. Trust that whatever happened, whatever choices were made, they were worth it to keep you and Lily safe. Shadow was never just a dog to me. He was my promise to always protect you, even when I couldn't be there myself. Love endures beyond death, beyond separation. Look for me in the way Shadow watches over Lily, in the way the sun feels warm on your face, in the moments of peace between heartbeats. I am there, always." As darkness settled over the estate, Jessica called Lily in for dinner. Shadow performed his nightly security check of the property, a ritual unchanged since their first days together, before taking his place beside Lily's bed, curled protectively around the place where she slept. Jessica knelt beside him, fastening Matthew's dog tags around Shadow's neck, the metal warm from being carried next to her heart all day. "Mission accomplished, boy," she whispered, pressing her forehead briefly against his. "He'd be so proud of you." Shadow's amber eyes met hers with the same unwavering loyalty he had always shown, a silent understanding passing between them. In the quiet of the evening, with Lily sleeping peacefully and Shadow standing guard, Jessica finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of healing, not an erasure of what had happened, but an integration of their experiences into a new life built on the foundation of Matthew's sacrifice and Shadow's enduring promise. The giant dog would continue to sleep curled around the little girl each night, not just because of a final order from his handler, but because in fulfilling that mission, he had found his own purpose, a love as deep and loyal as any human heart could offer. As Shadow keeps faithful watch over little Lily each night, we're reminded of what truly matters in this unpredictable world. Many of us understand loss, whether it's a spouse who served our country, a child who moved too far away, or dreams we reluctantly set aside. We've witnessed how quickly life can change, just as Jessica's did when Matthew never came home. Yet, in Shadow's unwavering dedication, we recognize the values we've cherished throughout our lives: loyalty that doesn't waver when tested, promises kept despite impossible odds, and love that transcends even death itself. When this German shepherd curls his massive frame around that sleeping child each night, he's not just following orders, he's teaching us that our greatest purpose comes from protecting those who depend on us. In a world that often seems to have forgotten the meaning of